Well, this is one of those very special days in the public square. The team is all here, but we get to sit and listen as Dave Zanotti talks with his good friend and professor, Dr. William B. Allen, and we are all eagerly anticipating this conversation, Dave, so take it away.
Thank you, Wayne. And Dr. Allen, welcome back as one of our dearest friends and a trustee of the American Policy Roundtable. And I could spend, as I usually say, the next 10 minutes on the balance of your bio, which by now our listeners will know. And if you're brand new, look it up. You'll be impressed. Dr. Allen, thank you for being the professor in residence for us, and we'd like to call upon you today to help us. I caught an article in The Atlantic called "The Moment of Truth," and as I read it, I had strong mixed emotions. The first emotion was of the first time I pulled your book on George Washington, the curated letters that you had put together in a masterful edition that's still for sale today on George Washington's life, 700 pages, and that I've had on my shelf for years and treasured. And then the day that I first ran into you in a master's course that you were teaching, and I realized I had finally met the name that was on that book. And then by God's merciful grace, more mercy to me than to you. Well, actually, you probably needed more grace. I needed the mercy. You began to let me pursue you. Some people call it academic stalking in the discussion of the life of George Washington, which turned into a book that you were so gracious to do the introduction for, that I was granted enough mercy to write. And I think I caught whatever the bug was that got you on the life of George Washington. Mm-hmm. One more point, if folks would like to go back and listen to one of the best broadcasts of the public square ever, please review the program which Dr. Allen and our team, and I had the privilege to join, toured Mount Vernon together. We spent an entire day there on a private tour, which is for very familiar grounds for W.B. Allen. He's been there many times and is well known by the Mount Vernon Ladies Association and the wonderful people who run Mount Vernon. I was the tag-along and got the opportunity to walk firsthand through the rooms, on the grounds, on the property, to the tomb of General Washington and learn more. So this has become a true passion to me. And so when The Atlantic decided they were going to permit Tom Nichols, also a college professor, to write an article in regards to this election season in George Washington, I quickly began reading, and then I quickly began missing my mentor. And so I had to call you immediately and say, please come talk to us on the public square about this article, because I think it's a window of opportunity for people to get more of the spirit of Washington as it applies to the hour of today. So that's a very long introduction to say we love you. Thank you for being with us again. And help, we need interpretive power. So we're calling in the big gun.
Well, it's so good to be with you all as usual. I consider it a blessing upon my life that we have these conversations. And I don't know about the vast audience and how far they can see the hand of God moving, but I can assure you I do. But this is an important topic, David, that you have brought up. And this article in The Atlantic is important in its own right, but more for what it does not say than for what it does say. Now, what it does say, you rightly suggested, though not elaborated at this point, namely that Washington is somehow looking down upon us with a frown on his face. He thinks that we are in the midst of a season of decline and that President Trump is a symbol of that decline. And this Professor Nichols goes so far as to enlist the testimony of people like General Kelly and others to assert that Trump is the anti-Washington. So before we get into the substance of it, I want you to indulge me for just about 5 minutes for some historical context. I don't usually do this, but I think this time it's important to do.
Please do.
And I want us to remember George Washington, the president. We don't have too much trouble remembering George Washington, the general. And we know the trials he faced, and we know that he established the entire notion of civilian control of the military while he served as commander-in-chief of the Revolutionary Army. He did that single-handedly because of the principles he embraced. And so when an appeal to this threat to civilian control of the military is made in our day, we have to go back and think carefully exactly what it means. And here's the context I want to provide in order to help us see that. One of the charges made against President Trump is that if he returns to the White House, he will use the American military against American citizens. A thing unheard of, they say, because, of course, they don't remember the Whiskey Rebellion of 1793. They don't remember George Washington himself personally taking command of national forces to march out into Western Pennsylvania to quiet a rebellion by American citizens. Blessedly, those citizens immediately retired as Washington approached, and he didn't have to spill their blood, but that he was prepared to do so to defend the Constitution and way of life is as clear as the morning sunshine at noon. So George Washington himself set the example of the urgencies in which it's necessary to invoke the military to quell rebellion. And I say that to people who know very well already that that wasn't simply an exercise in 1793, but it became a necessity in 1860-61, when American citizens rebelled and an American president had to organize the American army to quell the rebellion. And there ensued a long war of 5 years before it was resolved. So the idea that Trump saying there might be occasions on which you have to use the military to quell rebellion in the country is somehow outlandish, unthought of, and un-American. Ask us, ordinary citizens, to misbelieve what we already know from our history. It shows, in a certain sense, the contempt that those who make these arguments have for the American people. They actually believe that we do not know who we are and whose we are and where we've been. And we can give further examples of this. They say that President Trump abuses our allies and threatens to pull away from them and divide the Atlantic Alliance, which is the foundation of peace in the world. And they completely neglect to remind us that it was George Washington who, faced with a treaty of alliance with France as a result of the Revolutionary War, which helped us to win that war and gain our liberty, nevertheless, as president, following the French Revolution and the excesses of the French Directorate in the 1790s, had to pull back from that alliance, had to secure America rather than sacrifice America on the altar of mere fidelity to an alliance, which is, of course, the argument he presented in his farewell address in 1796, when he told us that, yes, we have interests abroad and we must protect those interests, but we must not entangle ourselves with them. So that all of these charges against Trump, using Washington as somehow the scourge with which to beat him, are false charges. They're not only without evidence, they're contrary to the evidence. They're the very opposite of the evidence that we all know. And I can elucidate, I can go on and provide several examples of Washington's performance as president, which demonstrate that there are moments in which a commander-in-chief must, as commander-in-chief, exercise those authorities in ways that protect the Constitution, and rather than protecting the supposed norms of the military. Which brings me to a concluding point, which I think is perhaps the most important of this. We have a roster of generals who became, of course, bureaucrats, who have come forward in the aftermath of the first Trump administration to say Trump is unworthy to serve, that he never should have been in the office and never should be again, that he is a man who is unfaithful to the Constitution, and that he was guilty of every contemporary notion of a sin. Racism, misogyny, etc. It goes on and on. Nichols lists them all. in his essay. But here's what I want you to remember and to try hard to understand. All of these people served in office without one of them, and I mean to emphasize that, not a single one of them having the courage and conviction of principle publicly to resign and to state why. They were all very good after leaving office with nothing to lose and the hope of toadying up to a successor that may be more favorable to them to declare the worst possible things. None of them had the guts to do so when in office. Now, the people of this country have a right to demand one thing above all else from those who purport to serve them, and that is that they will stand on principle in every circumstance. And if they find themselves troubled by what they're asked to perform as public servants, they have a duty to step out of office and declare publicly that this is how they understand it, and this is what is called for. They should all be Douglas MacArthur's in the end. But instead, what have we had? We've had the people who, during the Revolutionary War, formed what was called the Conway Cabal. The generals who sought to undermine George Washington and to unseat him without standing forth publicly and taking responsibility for what they were doing. That's what the Millies and Mattises and Kellys have been doing, among so many others. They are the modern Conway Cabal. And they went further than the Conway Cabal went. They literally staged a coup. Early in 2021, I published an essay in which I pointed out obvious facts that any intelligent observer could have noticed.
Dr. Allen, I hate to do this, but I need to jump in here to take a break for radio stations, but we will continue this conversation with Dr. William B. Allen. Don't miss it, coming up on the Public Square.
Hey, do you know who's running for president? Of course you do. But how about those down ballot races? Not as easy, is it? Visit ivoters.com for nonpartisan ballot information on candidates from the State House to the White House. It's not all about the president. Visit ivoters.com today.
Right back into our conversation today with our very special guest, Dr. William B. Allen. Dr. Allen, I interrupted you for the break. Please resume.
Thank you so much, Wayne. As I was referring to the modern-day Conway Cabal, which was a conspiracy against George Washington during the Revolutionary War. And what I pointed out is that in early 2021, following all of the mishigosh regarding the election of 2020, that there was one very palpable fact that should have been noticed by every intelligent observer. We saw complaints that President Trump sat in the White House doing nothing while there was a riot going on at the Capitol, without anyone noticing that he had been completely abandoned by the national security establishment. There was nothing he could do. Those who were responsible to gather in the Situation Room and brief the president and review options were not there. They were not receiving his phone calls. They had, in fact, been actively planning to abandon him, and they did abandon him. That was a successful coup at that moment. That was worse than the Conway Cabal. And these are the same people whom I described previously as not having the courage publicly to avow their principles and stand up and defend them, but who would work furtively, secretly, behind the scenes, using the powers and instrumentalities of government to undo constitutional government in the United States on the premise that they had a superior understanding and they didn't have to account to anyone for it. If there's been a threat to democracy in the United States, it has come from those who have assailed civilian control. For the civilian control of the military reposes in the commander-in-chief. The line of command descends from the commander-in-chief. Those who abandoned him in the period leading up to January 2021 abandoned that chain of command, abandoned civilian control of the military, and sought themselves to provide direction for the country. So not only were they people without principle and courage who would stand up and resign if they thought things were wrong, they were worse than that. They were people who sought to accomplish the objectives they believed to be appropriate without being answerable to anyone for it. So that's the overall historical context I wanted to present as you read this Atlantic article. Professor Nichols has presented a counter history, not the history that the American people know.
Doc, this is a common experience in American history at election times where certain people will publish articles trying to reflect upon how the candidates at hand today rate up against the first president. So this happens a lot, doesn't it?
It happens constantly and often mistakenly.
I'm mindful of the fact that Lincoln used this device in speeches as well.
Lincoln did, but in a very different way. And I remind you of 1838, Lincoln's Lyceum address, when he reverts to Washington. But he reverts to Washington in order to say, look, we need to ask ourselves, are we living up to the Washington standard? Washington created something, and we need to ask ourselves, are we capable of preserving it? Or are we going to fall into the trap of abandoning it? And remember the examples he used? The examples were those who would establish tyranny while proclaiming liberty, who would establish despotism while pretending to save democracy, those who would want to seek their own fame at the expense of their country's liberty. And as you go through Lincoln's litany, you can almost hear the voices of today as they cry out in all the terms Lincoln identified, but in order to defend processes and institutions which work against the constitutional principles of this republic.
I find this a fascinating conversation because I wondered, going into a study of Washington, whether or not this was a valid point of reference, whether in the most common street football terms, whether this guy was big enough to get the job done. I mean, in reality, he's come on, who is this guy really? And when you look, there's so much time that's gone on, and dress codes have changed, and people don't wear wigs with curls anymore. And I mean, come on, is this guy really the virtuoso that he has seemed to be 20, 30, 50 years after he passed? Well, I've got to tell you, the more I study George Washington, the more human he becomes, the more humble he becomes, the more earthly he becomes, organic, close to the ground, and the more compelling his story is. And the concept that George Washington understood what he was doing by design, that he had a term that I use in the book that you wrote the introduction for which I'm grateful. First, the leadership of George Washington, that he had a prescience, he had a knowledge, he had a foresight. Mm-hmm. He knew that he was modeling what leadership should look like, particularly in the presidency. He was very careful about this. And so as I'm reading Nichols talking about how far Trump is off the mark, I'm thinking to myself, well, yeah, and there's some things Trump's way off the mark in regards to the virtue and the self-control and the thoughtfulness. Let's get on Nichols' side of the ledger for just a second. Is it right to compare the virtue of Washington, the self-discipline of Washington, the sacrifice of Washington against the candidates of today?
It's fair. And they will all be found wanting. So both things are true. Washington is as great as you think he was, and the candidates of today are far less so. But that doesn't mean that they are not effective leaders or that they cannot serve well in government, particularly if they serve with a sense of responsibility and accountability. For the great life-saving and the great virtue-saving principle that descends from Washington is that there are institutions under which people who are held accountable can serve effectively as Washington served without being Washington. That's the beauty of the American Republic. It was designed to allow people to serve it as Washington served it without being Washington. Was he that great? Yes. George III thought so, considered him the most distinguished human being of the age, and rightly so. Now, that tells us, therefore, that we're not on quicksand when we praise George Washington. We're only on quicksand when we're quick to name somebody else as the equivalent of George Washington. That's when we get on quicksand, when we allow the posturing of mere candidates to try to appropriate the virtues of Washington. What we want of them instead is the humility to be subject to the influence of Washington. If they come before us as Lincoln did, acknowledging Washington's greatness and pledging to stand in Washington's traces, to march in Washington's traces, to pull, as it were, the chariot of this republic in the traces that Washington wore, then they're accepting accountability and responsibility, and they can serve effectively as Washington served. But they cannot replace Washington.
What I'd like to turn to, we need to take a break, but what I'd like to turn to now is the obvious reality that Professor Nichols, writing in The Atlantic, did not choose to hold the same standard of evaluation for the other person running in this race, which I find is most interesting because, in fact, in the actual article, which appears in the November 2024 edition of The Atlantic, the title of the article is not the same as the online title, according to the material we have today. The title in the Atlantic Monthly edition for November is Washington's Nightmare. Washington's Nightmare. Of course, the illustration is clear. Donald Trump would be George Washington's nightmare. So my question is, and Wayne, we'll come back on this when it gets started. If it's fair to hold Trump to that standard, then who's going to hold Kamala Harris to that standard? And since clearly the Atlantic isn't going to, we're going to in just a minute.
Well, again, I'm going to interrupt, but what you're listening to is a conversation between David Zanotti and Dr. William B. Allen. Fascinating so far, of course, especially I get that historical context. Our team has been listening as an audience as well as you, and if you would like to respond to our program, you can do that through our website, thepublicsquare.com. The whole team will be able to respond. At the end of the program, there should be time for that. So listen to this again online. If you joined us late, in the middle of that, you've got to go back to the beginning, and you can do that online at thepublicsquare.com or using our smartphone app. Okay. Part 2 coming up on The Public Square real soon. Stick with us.
Spreading the light of liberty across the land. Now back to The Public Square.
And we're back with The Public Square. This edition features Dr. William B. Allen in conversation with Dave Zanotti. And Dave, the mic is yours.
One of our favorite subjects to talk about now for several years, the life, the times, the character of George Washington and his influence to this very day. And Doc, as we've been talking, it's a familiar technique for journalists and others to write in comparison, for political leaders to write and ask, how are we doing measuring against the standard of George Washington? I was skeptical of it myself as a naive, undereducated individual on the life of Washington, and I still feel that I've only learned a teaspoonful compared to the river of work that you've done in this field. So Atlantic took their shot. Tom Nichols, a professor at the Naval War College for a number of years, decided to rise up and dust off his historical credentials and take a shot, calling Donald Trump Washington's nightmare. Now, to be fair, he may not be far from wrong. We don't know. We don't know if the two of those people were to sit down, which is obviously sort of a fairy tale approach. If they were to sit down, what counsel the first president might give the 45th and how stringent it might be. It might cause Donald Trump to walk out of the room and say, I never should have tried this, and I'm not going to try it again. We don't know. There's no way to know for sure. So Nichols has the right to speculate. My problem is he fails to speculate for the sake of the good of the country as to whether the alternative to a Trump presidency, a Harris presidency, would in fact not also cause not just heartburn, but in fact an additional nightmare to General Washington. Let me read this quote from the article. Trump is the man, says Nichols, Trump is the man the founders fear might arise from a mire of populism and ignorance.
I love the way you go quite immediately to the heart of the question. They think of the people as a mass of ignorance. And so that leads then into that line of thinking. But let's take a step back. Why should Tom Nichols, or whatever his name is, speak for George Washington? If George Washington has a nightmare, a worse nightmare, wouldn't we be appropriately advised to ask George Washington what that nightmare was? And would we fail to discover it? No, we discovered it very quickly. George Washington's worst nightmare was Thomas Jefferson. Yes.
True.
The founder of the Democratic Party. So much so that Thomas Jefferson became persona non grata at Mount Vernon. Why did he become persona non grata? Because he was a man of uncandid ambition. Outright ambition, but not candid about it. A man of great duplicity, and who did not shrink from falsehoods in seeking personal advantage, who lost the respect of the general because of his personal conduct, and whom the general saw building on the basis of popular opinion, popular enthusiasm, the potential precisely for the kind of tyranny that Nichols thinks Trump represents somehow. Now, you could ask the question, is Donald Trump the new Thomas Jefferson? Is that what Nichols is arguing? Since George Washington's worst nightmare was Thomas Jefferson, does it mean that Donald Trump is the heir to Thomas Jefferson? And if Donald Trump is the heir to Thomas Jefferson, what then must we think about the history of our country and what Thomas Jefferson promises, or what Donald Trump promises for its future? So this whole notion that Trump is somehow the anti-Washington, a potential tyrant, only will bear scrutiny if you see him in the mold of Thomas Jefferson, at least if you're looking through the eyes of George Washington. Now, I'm not suggesting that we look at Trump as somehow standing in the role of Thomas Jefferson, but I will underscore something for you. Trump's appeal to ordinary people certainly is like the appeal of Thomas Jefferson to ordinary people. And therefore, it is as dangerous or as little dangerous as was the appeal of Thomas Jefferson. So those who want to appraise Nichols' argument must appraise it on those grounds. Was Jefferson a threat to freedom in the United States? After all, he didn't do anything to resolve the problem of slavery and did much to make it worse. Was he a threat to liberty? Who knows? Is Trump any differently situated in that respect? Well, we know he's not defending slavery, although we toss around terms like racist, misogynist, and nativist. those are usually fabrications, not founded on any policy Trump has embraced or anything Trump has done, but misconstructions of Trump's own statements. For example, at Charlottesville, he said there were good people among Nazis and white supremacists. But that's a lie, and we know it's a lie. He didn't say it. In fact, he was trying to channel Abraham Lincoln, which we don't acknowledge. Lincoln's second inaugural address, when Lincoln said of the people involved in that conflict, we all pray to the same God. All Trump was saying was that in the debate over whether the monument should be removed or retained, there are good people making arguments on both sides. We all pray to the same God. So he was channeling Lincoln. He was not pretending that there was somehow something to be saved from people who were Nazi sympathizers or white supremacists. But the fact that others so willingly lie about it tell us who are the pretenders and who are, therefore, the likely tyrants.
Is it just too shallow for me to say, and I'll personalize it because I'm willing to take the hit, especially from my favorite professor, because I know he'll tell me straight. I think that both these candidates would give George Washington bad dreams.
I would say, and I'm not going to go with you there. I won't go that far. I'll tell you why. Washington did not have a great confidence in John Adams, okay? He thought John Adams had real problems. He thought he was, for one thing, too pretentious. He really did. He thought that this man's unbearably pretentious and thought too highly of himself. But at the same time, he was willing to work with him. He could see him serving the country. I don't think that he would have dismissed him completely, just as he was perfectly willing, and even fearing Thomas Jefferson as he did, to accept the outcome of the democratic process. Because ultimately, Washington referred what happened to the people, not to the putative leaders of the people. That's the main distinction. So the question of whether these candidates would give him nightmares is secondary to the question of whether Washington would embrace the people's judgment. And if the people's judgment was that this is the candidate that shall lead them forward, Washington would say, Amen.
Silence for effect. Alan, you can cut the silence for a bit. Go ahead, Wayne. You have a thought. That one hit me hard. Go ahead.
Silence for effect, indeed. But that gives us an opportunity to take a break here in the public square. Understanding history is shedding much light on our current situation in America. Our guest is Dr. William B. Allen. We'll continue the conversation with Dave Zanotti coming up on the public square. Aren't you glad you tuned in to the public square today? I tell you, we're all sitting here. That moment of silence a moment ago tells the story because we're drinking this in. There's more to come now with Dave Zanotti and Dr. William B. Allen. Dave?
Doc, there's another premise that Professor Nichols brings to this article, and that's that, let me read it to you in a quote. The American revolutionaries feared a powerful executive. They had, after all, just survived a war with the king. Yet when the founders gathered in 1787 to draft the Constitution, they approved a powerful presidential office because of their faith in one man, Washington. I personally would venture to take issue with that. He goes on to try to develop that theme further in this. He goes on to say his fellow founders, Washington's fellow founders, left much in Article 2 of the Constitution vague. That's the executive branch segment. They disagreed among themselves about the powers that executive branch should hold, and they were willing to let Washington fill in at least some of the blanks regarding the scope of presidential authority. This choice has bedeviled American governance, allowing successive chief executives to widen their own powers, especially in foreign policy. So he starts with the premise that because it was Washington, they figured he'll fill in the blanks and make it work, and that's bothered us for some time. Something about that just, I'm not so sure. What do you think?
Well, I think you're right to hesitate. I don't think it was a mere leaving the blanks unfilled in because Washington was going to fill them in. I think it was a statement about the character of executive authority and leadership. They understood several things. And among those things, not the least important, was to be able to speak to the world with a single voice. Through one nation before the rest of the world, not a multiplicity of nations or states, and not a multiplicity of voices. And so a powerful executive, and this argument is made compellingly in the Federalist Papers, a powerful executive who could speak with authority was critical to the functioning of the government of the United States. It was not a blank slate. It was a slate filled in with power so that there could be projection of American influence abroad. And that's what was dependent upon. Yes, Washington was relied upon to execute that responsibility ably. That is true. But it wasn't blank. It was filled in with authority and power. And it has developed consistently along those lines ever since. There's another statement in this that goes to the heart of this, early in the essay by Nichols, in which he describes Washington as refusing to remain in command at the end of the Revolutionary War. That is a misstatement. He didn't refuse to remain in command. To say he refused is to imply that he was begged to stay and said no. That's not what happened. He voluntarily relinquished command, and his fellow citizens were grateful to him for doing so. He was following the principles of virtue, the Cincinnatus principles of the general victorious returning to his farm, not asserting control, and even the philosophical principles taught by Machiavelli, of all people, that a truly successful general, if he wishes to remain successful and to preserve a reputation, ought to abandon the command and return to the status of a citizen, and thereby win the affection of his fellow citizens. So that this was not a refusal to remain in command, this was the embrace of a virtuous option. Washington made a decision, and that decision was his own decision based on who he was. And so it's also true with respect to the exercise of executive powers. If you'll remember, when they were dealing with the Little Sarah affair, you don't have to remember that. That's okay. It surrounds Citizen Genet, the French ambassador, who was trying to foment rebellion in the United States and running around saying, I will appeal to the people above the president. Well, Washington dealt with that quite well, even to the point where, having, of course, delegated authority to his Secretary of State, Thomas Jefferson, to handle that and to take care of this privateering ship, the Little Sarah, and finding Jefferson hesitating and not acting promptly, did it himself, exerted himself, because what was important was to act in defense of the country's interests. And no one has that ultimate authority beyond the chief executive. This was written into the Constitution. It was not added to the Constitution by Washington. Washington was fulfilling his obligations. So this argument, and it's not a new argument Nichols makes, others have made the argument, is simply a faulty understanding of the underlying political principles.
Doc, what other points leapt off the page for you on this article?
Oh, I think I've hit most of them. I find what Nichols has done, and you mentioned it earlier when you said he doesn't apply it to the other candidate, is tried to warp into a partisan configuration what ought to have been a broad and comprehensive historical examination. It is not a comprehensive historical examination. It is a mere tool in partisan warfare. And just like all the name calling that has infected this election season, this is part of that name calling. It is not part of appealing to the public or making arguments that the public can digest. In fact, it expresses contempt for the public. And I think the one thing that jumps out at me more than anything else is this habit of displaying contempt for ordinary people that so infects those who wish to argue against Donald Trump and to argue against conservatism in general.
Sorry for the pause, Alan. He keeps doing this to me. Doc, we've often talked about using Washington as a standard of measurement. One of the things I believe Nichols mentioned in his article, or it was several others I was researching to prepare for this conversation, was the fact that it was a full year after leaving office before George and Martha Washington had a dinner that was not attended by guests at Mount Vernon. Now, we know from being there and because of your gracious letting us into the back gate of Mount Vernon that the Washingtons were in a very difficult position because people from around the world, let alone across the nation, who had any form of introduction to come to Mount Vernon would just show up for a visit with the president. This was after he had left office. And so you stated earlier that Thomas Jefferson was persona non grata at Mount Vernon. That was quite an accomplishment.
Yeah. That was quite an accomplishment because nobody was turned away usually. It was as if they were maintaining a public house. And from being there, it's not a very expansive property from that point of view. And they were putting people up because you didn't visit Mount Vernon and then go to a hotel down the road. There was nothing else down there. They had to put them all up right there on the property. So they were constantly besieged and they were very gracious hosts in the process of doing that. And so to be excluded from that is a signal accomplishment, if that's not speaking too euphemistically.
Well, I'll flesh it out a little further. After the general's passing, Thomas Jefferson came to Mount Vernon to extend his condolences to Mrs. Washington, and she was not interested in visiting with him.
And she was more emphatic than the general was that he was persona non grata. And they had good reason for that. And they didn't pretend.
Can I ask why he had Jefferson as the Secretary of State then?
Because he was strongly recommended by James Madison, and Jefferson was in France at the time the appointment was made. Jefferson was, of course, an accomplished diplomat and distinguished citizen and leader. And James Madison was someone upon whom Washington relied in forming government at the outset. He was almost a prime minister for George Washington in that first year. And so he named Jefferson as Secretary of State on that recommendation. It wasn't long before it proved to be a decision he wished had been made otherwise.
Let's pause here. You've been listening to Dr. William B. Allen on the Public Square with Dave Zanotti, and the team has been listening intently. And I think, Dave, we can turn to the team for questions next in our segment. If you must leave us at this time, if your station cuts away, you can hear the interaction coming up at thepublicsquare.com and with our smartphone app as well, called The Public Square, free in your app store.
Spreading the light of liberty across the land. Now back to the Public Square.
And we're back with you on the Public Square, a very special segment of the program coming up. But I feel we're going to run out of time here on this weekend edition, Dave. So let's agree right now that we're going to continue this conversation onto our daily program, TPS Express. And you can hear that on radio stations. You can hear it online at thepublicsquare.com. Okay, let's begin with the panel. By the way, that includes Jeff Sanders, Melanie Elsey, Rob Walgate, and our producer, Alan C. Duncan.
Who's first?
Well, this sounds like a silly question, but I'm just really curious because you're really the Washington expert here, and I just dabble in George Washington. Who did he really like? I mean, besides Martha, obviously. Who was his He was not known to be a very gregarious person, as I understand it, and have a whole bunch of friends. In fact, he said, you shouldn't have a lot of close friends. Who did he really rely upon? Was it James Madison?
The people whom, in the fullness of time, were closest to his mind were people like Alexander Hamilton and Gouverneur Morris.
Is that right?
And that they proved to be outstanding counselors to him. He relied upon them greatly.
Well, might I add, the story of Washington's relationship with Hamilton is worthy of a book, another book, which I know you're busy writing another book right now. Would you talk about that for just a minute?
Well, I think people have misunderstood that for a long time, and particularly because of some exaggerated tales about the youthful Hamilton falling out with the general because he wasn't advancing far enough in military rank and responsibility. But Hamilton was like a son to George Washington, and a son who's had to be chastised sometimes, as sons often do. But they grew in confidence and mutual understanding to the point where you could hardly distinguish one mind from the other, apart from the fact that obviously Hamilton had a more disciplined education than George Washington had. In terms of their thinking, they were essentially one mind. And you see this play out particularly in the farewell address. And people like to say, Washington didn't write the farewell address, Hamilton did. That's a mistake. The farewell address was crafted over a period of 3.5 months with constant correspondence back and forth between Washington and Hamilton. Washington directing, editing, changing. Hamilton, of course, making quite fruitful suggestions along the way, and then giving it the polish that it acquired in the end, because Hamilton was, of course, the polished writer. But they did that working in sync, and they thought together. Another example of this is when the Jay Treaty was adopted, and it was extremely controversial because Washington made this treaty in a manner that led some people, including Madison and Jefferson and others, to oppose its ratification. But Washington had some principal bases for his decision, including moral basis, including the refusal to include the return of slaves in the final treaty. And what he did in order to defend the treaty was turn to Hamilton and get Hamilton to lead the public campaign, setting forth those moral arguments, which were Washington's arguments, but Hamilton was the public voice for these arguments. That's how closely they worked together. And that was sustained throughout Washington's life. There was never a point in which Washington withdrew from Hamilton or the reverse.
Okay.
Melanie?
I want to go back to the Atlantic piece because I was frustrated reading it. So many details were either misrepresented or omitted or to me, it was just a piece of propaganda written by somebody with a title or a credential behind their name, someone with a viewpoint that they wanted to just espouse their viewpoint. And my frustration is with someone coming to this Atlantic piece, reading it without a historical background, it's deceiving. So my question is, what can the average citizen do to protect themselves from the deception of something like this, where they're pulling from history and twisting things into a particular narrative that simply isn't true?
A great question, Melanie. And I think the first thing the ordinary citizen always ought to ask is, where's it coming from? What's the source? And that this is a professor at the Naval War College should promptly remind you of what I said at the outset. We've had a national security infrastructure that, in fact, undermined the chain of command. And the likelihood that this person is a low underling in that infrastructure is very high and is continuing that effort. You almost can be assured of that by the extremity of what he has to say about President Trump. He's laying out an argument that makes it impossible to obey. That's the first thing to observe. He, who works at the Naval War College, and therefore is in the military, strictly speaking, cannot obey Donald Trump as commander-in-chief. That's been made perfectly clear. And therefore, if Donald Trump is elected, he has no route that he can follow with honor other than to resign his position.
Mm-hmm.
And you may be sure he's not going to do that. Instead, he's going to be an Alexander Vindman who will stay in office and seek to undermine and to do it in the dark and not to address the public openly and honestly. That's what you should derive from this. If you ask, where is it coming from? What is the context in which it is being written? And what does it suggest about the future?
Rob.
Well, I think that was the frustrating part for me as well, knowing the article was authored by Tom Nichols and then going back and looking through his social media profiles and other things and seeing how he labels himself as democracy enthusiast, defender of experts. You know, my question for him would be is what would he consider an expert and why wouldn't he consult them on the writings of this material? And to the democracy aspect, I mean, in his writings on that page, on Twitter, on X, you know, he rips the New York Times before an election for giving Jill Stein a full page. Now, is Jill Stein going to get a large percentage of the vote? Has she in the past? No. But as someone who wants to defend what he calls democracy, you would think you'd want everyone educated in all aspects of what is taking place across the country. But it seems the people that scream that the loudest and don't understand the construct of the country are the ones who want everyone to wear the most narrow goggles. And that's a frustrating part for me. So I think that was more of a rant than a question for you, Dr. Allen. But in reading that piece, that's all I could think.
Caller, what's your question? What's your question, caller?
It's a timely rant, and it's well placed, and it's an accurate description of the reality we're facing. Basically, the article is a rant. The Atlantic article is a rant. It is not substantive, as we've seen. It's misrepresented George Washington. It misrepresents Donald Trump. So that even when you know that you might harbor some doubts about Trump in this way or that, you would have trouble finding it in this article. You're going to have to supply that on your own. So yes, it is a rant. But again, the point is, this person is ranting when he's defending the experts. The expert is a synonym for the people in charge. Okay? That's what it means. He's writing in defense of the people in charge. And they could care less about the other folk.
Well, as promised, there are more questions. And as promised, it'll carry over to the next edition of our daily Public Square program, which, if it's not on your radio station to listen, you can certainly listen online at thepublicsquare.com. Dave, any final comment on what we've heard here today?
Quickly, yes. And if you're on our email list, you'll get the email blast of this program that's coming up on the further questions right into your inbox. Okay. So please make sure we're in touch.
And share that. Share that indeed. All right. Thanks for listening, everybody. Thanks, panel. Thank you, Dr. Allen. We'll talk to you again.
The Public Square is a broadcast service of the American Policy Roundtable.